All right, I'm just going to give this a minute to catch up with itself. Nope, dinner's ready. All right, pull all this over. We are now live. Hey, Ken.
Hi, buddy.
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So today we were basically going to pick up our discussion from last month. We did a really wonderful episode. I don't know, it was about 2.5 hours or so about integral historiography. In particular about an essay you had written called "Who Ate Captain Cook," which
Right.
is a lot of people's, one of our favorite essays that you've written. And today we just wanted to sort of conclude that conversation, and this will probably be a fairly quick one.
Sure.
But there were a few sort of common historiographical fallacies that we wanted to discuss that we never really got into last month. We just
Right.
didn't have a chance to get into, so we wanted to cover that this week.
Sure.
And those three fallacies are basically just, ways that we can enact the past incorrectly. And these are, again, three of the most common fallacies that you see out there. And there's been a lot of sort of literature in the historiographical field about how to sort of identify and avoid these fallacies.
Right.
But I think that an integral approach to these fallacies, it sort of, it gets really interesting because I think we have a few things to add.
Right.
And maybe we might actually see that a couple of these fallacies are sort of a little bit partial as they've sort of been taken so far. And I also just wanted to mention that when it comes to these fallacies and to really sort of I got a lot of this research from a really, really great community. And it's kind of funny, Ken, because last month we talked about your essay, "Who Ate Captain Cook," which was really sort of delineating the conflict in historiography between sort of, orange modern facts only interpretations, and then green interpretations only
Right.
interpretations. Now, the funny thing is, one of my favorite communities where I find a lot of really, really rich discussions about history is actually in Reddit, of all places. And there's a community called Ask Reddit. I'm sorry, Ask Historians. And what's really, really funny about that community is one of the things that makes it really, really successful is that it is privileging, I'd say mostly an orange enactment of history, but it runs its community using very, very, very strict amber rule sets because, history is so awash in, well, bad history. There's so much bad history out there that these guys wanted to create a space to really allow sort of a top-down dissemination of expertise rather than this kind of bottom-up churning of weird perspectives and just more bad history.
Right.
So it just goes to show how important having a strong and enforceable amber rule set is, even when we're having conversations about orange interpretations of history and green interpretations of history and teal and turquoise interpretations of history. It's just always been kind of funny to me that that community thrives
Yeah.
because of that really, really strong amber rule set. And for
Right.
everyone watching this, I definitely encourage you to check it out. Reddit.com /r/ask historians. It's a really great community. So today we're going to be talking about these three fallacies. And basically these three, just to list them out at the front here, they're known as presentism, which is often called the historian's fallacy. And this is a really, really important one, and probably the one I'm guessing we'll spend the most of our time. There's another one, and I've always really liked this phrase, chronological snobbery, which was actually coined by C.S. Lewis. And then the third one is teleological historiography. And that's an interesting one, and I'm sure we'll have some interesting things to say about it. And to start off, we're going to be talking about presentism, the historian's fallacy. So as we were saying, there are a few fallacies that are commonly discussed in modern and postmodern historiography, most of which is really an effort to prevent sort of allowing our personal and cultural biases from distorting our enactment of history.
Right.
And one of the main ones here is presentism, which, usually arises from this desire to sort of emphasize the connection between the past and the present. So presentism is it describes this process where we sort of project our present day values and ideas and perspectives and moral standards and things like that and views really onto historical events. And, this is usually not such a good idea because not only are you producing, these really inaccurate and distorted interpretations of historical events, but it also opens the door to all kinds of cultural biases and blind spots that really cause the historian to kind of rewrite history in ways that are, either consciously or unconsciously supporting their own contemporary ideologies. A common example of this is, judging the American forefathers for owning slaves, which, yeah, they did. That's a historical fact. Most of them owned slaves. But sort of leaving it at that really, I think, ignores the moral and ethical context of the time, which is something that we've talked about a lot, especially the fact that, these guys are the ones who made sort of a series of decisions that allowed our forefathers to put an end to the practice of chattel slavery altogether. So that's an example of presentism, where we're sort of judging people in the past based on our values of today. And, another recent example of this, a really great one, was Governor Northam in North Carolina, I think it was, who a photo ended up coming out of him in blackface.
Right.
Which I think we would all agree, blackface, not such a good idea. Right. Maybe definitely don't do blackface. Right. But this picture was from 1985, right? So it's 35 years ago. And it resurfaces, and all of the liberals, all of the really, really hyperventilating wing of the left started calling for his resignation.
Yeah.
And it's a really funny thing to me because not only, okay, so let's be clear. This happened in 1985. In 1986, there was a mainstream comedy featuring white people in blackface. So when we're actually going back to sort of the views and the values and the morals of the time, blackface was not as, it didn't provoke as much of an ew response as it does today, which makes a lot of sense. So it's okay, I think, to give a little bit of latitude in cases like this. And I just, something we should say to our, to any progressives who are watching this, if you consider yourself a progressive, that kind of hinges on the idea that people and systems can evolve over time, that we can get better. We become better. We make mistakes, we learn from those mistakes, and that's called progress. That's the root of progressivism. So it's really funny whenever I see progressives sort of, turning into, the morality police, really. Right. It triggers these really strong amber reactions. And it's like, what's separating you from sort of a cliche conservative at this point? You're having the exact same reactions and responses that you're accusing the other side of having, right, around this sort of moral purity. So this is what presentism is. This is what it does to distort our readings of the history of history. And then there's a particular form of presentism that's known as the historian's fallacy. And this describes sort of a hindsight bias, where people in the past should have somehow seen events from the same perspective that we see them today. Right. So it's kind of like the idea that once something happens, it's really, really easy for us to sort of cherry pick the historical record and say, oh, well, they should have seen this coming. And we judge their decisions and their judgments based on this sort of evidence that wasn't apparent before this event happened. A common one here is Pearl Harbor. A lot of people say, there was so many evidence that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. We had so much sort of information buzzing around saying that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. Therefore, we should have expected Pearl Harbor. Well, that only becomes clear once it actually happens. Before it happens, there was, 1,000 different data points that were suggesting 1,000 different vectors of attack, and Pearl Harbor turned out to be the one that happened. So this hindsight bias can be sort of just as blinding as presentism. It's actually a form of presentism. So anyway, this is a really, really important, I think, fallacy for us to talk about, especially because it connects, Ken, with what you were talking about a couple of months ago with social justice. I just gave the Governor Northam example, but this is something we see all the time, where a reactionary sort of group of people are trying to hold people yesterday accountable for their views and values that they're holding today. And this just causes, a big mess, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, what we're talking about here, when you talk about these three fallacies is actually sort of in an overall scheme. It's how we actually make judgments between the present, the past, and then the present and the future. And the first fallacy, presentism and historian's fallacy, those are variations on the fact that, even though I'll clarify this, but it's a variation on the fact that there's really no fundamental difference between the values of today and the values of yesterday. So when we look at presentism, the thing about saying, well, the founding fathers had slaves, and so that was horrible. Well, that's the assumption that the exact same morals that are operating today were operating then. And so we should judge people then according to exactly the same morals that we have now. And the historian's fallacy is the same thing. It's assuming a fundamental equality of values, but it's assuming that yesterday could see the same moral landscape that we see today. Right. And so there was no difference. So fundamentally, what you're finding on these first types of fallacies is this fundamental denial of any sort of evolution in any direction, either a devolution or a teleological evolution, but they're essentially similar values. And that's how we have to look at history. And what it really does, and that's why something like the historian's fallacy is really ironically named, because what it really means is there is no history. It's all fundamentally the same. We end up applying the same values across the board, one way or another. But that's the fundamental assumption that we're seeing here. Now, in all three of these fallacies, by the way, of course, being integral, maintains that all of them are true but partial. Right. There are partial truths in all of these. But there's a fundamental denial of an evolutionary unfolding, even in just a general sense, when we're looking at things like presentism or something like the historian's fallacy. And there's actually, and we'll talk about this as we go on, but some things can get better, some things can get worse, but there is this fundamental evolutionary unfolding. It's the same eros that we see going all the way back to the Big Bang, and it just sort of continues. There are ups and downs, just like the stock market. So you do hit things like the Great Depression and everything goes south for a long time, but eventually it comes back up. And one of the main reasons for that is that there does appear to be this very, very fundamental force in the universe itself that is a drive towards increasing complexity and increasing differentiation and integration. And we see that direction occurring over 14 billion years. The universe is not winding down. The universe is winding up. And the only way you sort of get the notion of it winding down is if you cut off a piece of the universe and put it in a box and seal it and then watch it, it'll run down. And so if you take like a drop of ink and put it in a glass of water, it'll always disperse. It'll never draw up into a drop of ink unless you take that out and let it mix with the entire universe and then watch it for a billion years. And what you'll find is that those drops of ink come together, atoms and molecules come together to form droplets that are actually called living cells. And that's the direction that will go in the real world. So the second law of thermodynamics is true, but only in a cut off isolated sections of the universe. And then it always runs down. But when you let it interact with everything else that's going on, there's a fundamental drive towards winding up. Now that doesn't, again, stop things from going up and down and good stuff, bad stuff. But Emily Dickinson, when it comes to history, and she, of course, was an absolutely exquisite writer.
Mm-hmm.
But she had my favorite statement about the relation of the present to the past. And again, this is just generalization. And what's great about it is it's only 4 words. And she, of course, was a poetic genius, but her statement was, today makes yesterday mean.
Mm.
And it just does, on balance, it does. So that's one of the things that we have to look at. And what that is reflecting, again, is just this broad arrows, this broad unfolding of transcending and including, transcending and including. And that is the fundamental way that holons in the universe find a way to react with each other, to fit together. And so that's why leading edge, not only evolutionary theorists, but leading edge systems theorists, chaos, complexity theorists, maintain that there actually is a 5th force, an actual force in the universe. And in addition to strong and weak nuclear, electromagnetic, and gravitational, there's a 5th actual drive in the universe. And that is often referred to as just self-organization. And some people will refer to it as just an increase in complexity. And then if we take Teilhard de Chardin's law of complexity and consciousness, then you get an increase in material complexity is accompanied by an increase in consciousness. So as you go from quarks to atoms, to molecules, to cells, to organisms, that's an increase in complexity. And it's also accompanied by an increase in consciousness. Each one of those is becoming a little bit more aware. They have a little bit more prehension, a little bit more capacity for sensation and perception, and so on. And so that first fallacy that we have to be careful about is that, no, the values that we have now and the values that were present 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, they're not the same.
Right.
Some things are the same, some things have gotten slightly worse, but there's also this broad, subtle increase in complexity and consciousness. And that also means wholeness, differentiation, integration, and so on. Then the next fallacy, the chronological snobbery.
I love that
That's
phrase.
basically just says that, okay, these 2 values aren't the same, that today's values are just completely better than yesterday's. And so that's just the only way to look at it. And everything about today is much better than yesterday. And that's the direction that that's going. And again, there's small, partial truths in that, but we can't use that as a guiding theme for history or historiography, because by itself, it's just simply wrong.
Right.
And then the other one, in terms of teleological historicity, then that sees value going sharply in the other direction, that tomorrow is better than today. And so that there's always a tendency in that most of the people that have proposed those kinds of views just happen to find themselves sitting on a higher place of evolution than
That's right.
previous historical occasions. So things like weak history or Hegel or any of those. But this does continue, most of them, although some of them just stop with, it just got better and better and better and better. But there's no reason that that wouldn't just continue. And so we'll talk about those when we get to those. But going back to the first one, the whole presentism and the whole historian's fallacy. Sort of one of the things that Who Ate Captain Cook tended to focus on was just that difference in how yesterday saw the world versus how today sees the world. And that these are important differences, and we have to understand that they're real, those differences are there, and they are continuing. I mean, if nothing else, you can just look at the lower right quadrant, which is looking at any holon from a third person plural perspective. And that does tend to mean things like technological innovations.
Mm-hmm.
And just in terms of technology, there's been a striking, unmistakable forward movement in increasing technological sophistication. And again, every now and then you'll find periods in history where that kind of breaks down and there can be regression or something like that. But on balance, it just continues to go upward and upward and upward. And whether you attach value to that or not, it does tend to accompany many other factors in cultures that certainly individuals at the time, and certainly even looking back on it, we can see as an increase in things that were, in some sense, more valuable, that were better, that had an increase in some sort of capacity that could be judged a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that can also mean good things if they're handled well, because technology has that strange capacity of not in itself, in terms of what you can do with it, that it's not inherently good or bad, but how we use it. So just a standard, a knife isn't good or bad. It can be used to stab people. That's bad. It can be used to do surgery, help somebody, and that's good.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing inherently good or bad in a knife, but there are inherently good or bad things in how human beings use those. But setting that aside, there is this increase of technological capacity that we see as a pretty much ongoing, irreversible trend.
Mm-hmm.
And so that just in itself, not even looking at values or worldviews or levels of consciousness or anything like that, but just a technological movement that unmistakably moves forward in a lot of really fundamental ways. And it's going to continue. And we can see that kind of evolutionary unfolding, and the continuing today makes yesterday mean kind of increase. If we just look back and think, well, look at the world, look at the Middle Ages 500 years ago and what they felt was true and real and important and valuable, and realize how much of that we sort of look at and go, it wasn't so great, actually. But of course, 500 years from now, that's how people will look at us.
Right.
So, I mean, we're not going to get out of this. And one of the things you don't want to do is, if you're trying to track these broad evolutionary historical unfoldings, is you don't want to just stop at where you are. And so if you're seeing things go up and it's just to where you are, then this is the sum total. This is as best as history will ever get. This is the end of history. It can't get any better. This is just that wonderful. 500 years from now, let's see where it is.
Right.
And we almost certainly, on the technological front, will be, just in terms of artificial intelligence, some of the estimates for singularity and a introduction of super intelligent machines. Some people put that, I mean, Kurzweil's putting the singularity coming as early as around 2047, so around 2050, which is really just a few decades from now.
Blink of an eye.
So we don't even have to think 500 years.
Right.
We can think just even 50 years. Looks like something like that could be happening. And so that's just tracking the lower right quadrant. So we see similar kinds of changes occurring in the other quadrants. And obviously, again, with this technology, and this goes all the way back to fire and the bow and arrow, up to crossbows, catapults, gunpowder, atomic bombs. These could be used in positive ways, or they can be used in really catastrophic ways. And that doesn't look like that's going to stop. That capacity to use these technological innovations in a whole spectrum of moral orientations, from very bad to very good, it is something that looks like it's always going to be with us when it comes to technology. And that goes for artificial intelligence. There are at least some, the field's almost divided half and half. There are at least some experts that think that we can use machine superintelligence in a way that will augment human capacity. And that would be a very, very good thing. But then there's probably about half of the experts say that as soon as we discover the first super intelligent machine, that will be the last thing human beings discover, and it will kill us. Not necessarily out of malevolence. It's just that it's such a radically different and alienated type of intelligence than anything that showed up so far, that it just doesn't fit into the universe the same way, let's say, a dog's intelligence or a chimpanzee's intelligence or a human's intelligence is part of an organic unfolding of the universe and sort of fits in with the universe. Machine intelligence isn't doing that.
Right.
It's really rather separate, all on its own. And worst of all of the previous forms of intelligence in the world have been part of an evolutionary unfolding. They're actually plugged in to previous stages of intelligence. So each of the stages of organic intelligence really are transcending and including, transcending and including, transcending and including. So even a human brain, human intelligence, has a reptilian brain stem, including the type of intelligence that reptiles had developed. We have a paleo-mammalian limbic system, which includes the type of intelligence that horses and other paleo mammals would have. And then it has the cortex, which advanced mammals and primates have. So those are all enfolded into each other. But then when we started creating artificial intelligence, basically what we did is we just skimmed off the top of human intelligence. And so if we made like a chess algorithm, then that was really functioning on a type of rational set of algorithms that just ran rationality out. The algorithm that can beat any human being in chess doesn't include a paleo mammalian system. It doesn't have a reptilian brainstem. It just has the skimmed off rationality from a neocortex.
Right.
And that means it's not really plugged into the rest of the universe the way all the previous intelligences were. And it's just that alien type of intelligence, because it would not inherently share values of life that all of the previous intelligences had in their own way, that it just could, just by being so different, from the type of intelligence that we have, that if we don't work really hard to make sure that it's just augmented, then it really could just go off and do its own thing and just inadvertently wipe us off the face of the planet.
Oops.
Yeah, so we have that's coming along. But all of that points to a history that denies this fundamental fallacy, which is that somehow the values of today and tomorrow are essentially similar. Making the mistake of either we're reading today's values into yesterday, or we think yesterday could see the world in an incredibly clear way, essentially just like we can today.
Mm-hmm.
And all of just the technological unfolding itself points directly to how that is a fallacy. Presentism and the historian's fallacy really are fallacies. Now, it doesn't stop, again, it doesn't stop them from having certain kind of partial truths.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly if we just look at human beings, for example, even though along with things like technological evolution, we would also track moral evolution, cognitive evolution, spiritual, aesthetic, and other types of evolution. Those are occurring, again, with ups and downs. But we have to track evolution in all four quadrants. But there are things that stay essentially similar, even though their surface structures are changing a lot. And one of those is just the four quadrants themselves. Those are dimensions that appear to go all the way down. And so as evolution went forward, it was evolution that was occurring in all four quadrants, and the four quadrants stayed essentially the same, even as the forms of them continued to unfold and evolve and unfold, transcend and include, transcend and include. But we still had those four quadrants, and those are still present in the very first human beings. And so we start to look at how human beings at every epoch that they've existed, one of the things they've been doing is dealing with the four quadrants and dealing with it in their own ways, some of which were better than we're doing it today, some of which were worse. But in any event, they were there. And so that's simply an aspect that doesn't itself step outside, or that itself does step outside of evolution. And we want to keep that in mind as well. Those would be one of the things that we would want to track if we are tracking historiography. So even on something like Who Ate Captain Cook, where one of the main things that was focused on in that piece was just looking at the different worldviews and the different moral drives that went with those. And we were pointing out how there were two very sharply different worldviews that ended up getting Captain Cook roasted and eaten. So those are something that we do want to track. But we're also, of course, tracking what's happening in the other four quadrants. So one thing in the lower right quadrant is there was a technological difference as well. So Captain Cook is the one that shows up in ships that had traveled all the way across the Pacific, something that the islanders themselves couldn't do because their technological development wasn't up to that type of capacity. And again, that's not a type of moral judgment. It's not being, and it's certainly not any sort of chronological snobbery per se. It's simply, as descriptively as possible, tracking out what's happening in the various four quadrants.
Yep.
And then you are allowed to look at things like, let's say, moral development and then make judgments about, well, this is better or this is worse than other times. And although there's a type of postmodernism that's very, very adverse to making those kinds of judgments, that judgment that postmodernism makes is exactly the same kind of judgment. They're making judgments about whether you can say something is better or something isn't better. So they're making the same kind of judgment, only they're pretending they're not making those kinds of judgments.
That's right.
So that's a flat out self-contradiction that we just try to avoid, because massive self-contradiction is not a good way to do historiography.
Right.
It's just not something that you want to try to emulate.
Right.
So these are important aspects. It's certainly the case that we want to be careful in terms of, and this will seem sort of paradoxical, because if we're looking at, let's say, moral evolution, and there's just no question but that, along with most of the other multiple intelligences and most factors in the other quadrants, that there is a type of, again, broad evolutionary unfolding. And so when we go back and look at earlier stages that were clearly at previous lower stages of, let's say, moral development, then we don't want to hesitate in saying, okay, some of these previous stages were at lower levels of moral development.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at slavery, for example, slavery existed for virtually all of human history until really just only about 150 years ago. And so all through the Middle Ages and in cultures all over the world, including cultures that had created the great religious traditions, including the great meditative traditions. I mentioned previously that Thomas Sowell, who's an absolutely brilliant Black American political and economic theorist, did a history on slavery. And he pointed out that even in virtually all of the great civilizations that had the great religions, they all had slavery,
Mm-hmm.
and they had no problem with it. So as he puts it, quote, Buddhist monasteries had slaves, Christian monasteries had slaves, and he would add, so did virtually every other religious monastery have slaves. And so we have to be careful about that. It wasn't until around the Western Enlightenment, when we got a shift up from ethnocentric morality to world-centric morality, that slavery was outlawed. And so in around a 100-year period, from 1770 to 1870, slavery was outlawed in every major rational industrial country on the face of the planet. Nothing like that had ever happened before. And so we have every right of going back. Well, what we don't want to do is look back at periods prior to that 100-year period,
Mm-hmm.
where slavery was acceptable, and then condemn them for having slaves.
Right.
That's exactly what is not fair. And that's exactly a wrong way to look at history. And so this is when you were talking about even things like the Founding Fathers, most of whom had slaves. They almost all of them recognized that they had embraced moral principles and these are still a little bit early. It was still, 1700s, early 1700s.
Pre-industrial.
Prior to that period
Mhm.
where slavery had become outlawed, largely based on principles discovered by these white European males.
Right. And catalyzed by technology in the lower right, right? I mean, that set of moral codes in the lower left and the upper left was made possible on this sort of mass collective level by industrial technology.
Yeah, absolutely. There was, and I have to be really careful because this is an extremely politically incorrect thing to talk about.
We love those.
But Amory Hunter, who's probably one of the really handful of most brilliant alternative energy thinkers on the planet, he runs something called the Rocky Mountain Institute. And he calculated something that he just referred to as slave power.
Mm-hmm.
And what this meant was, if you look back at previous eras of human technological development, from foraging to horticultural to agrarian to industrial to informational, and then looked at, in essence, what the types of technology at each of those eras, then how much slave power did the technology give each man, woman, and child? So in foraging, it was like maybe two. Each man, woman, and child had the equivalent of around 2 slave power, 2 human power that was available to them. And then as you get into horticultural, then it was up to about 3.5. When you got into agrarian, it was up to like around 12. So each person in an agrarian society had around 12 humans working for them, simply because of what their technology did on their behalf.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you get into industrial society, each man, woman, and child had an average of 53 humans working for them. So if you own 53 slaves, it's pretty easy to outlaw slavery. If you only have 2 slaves, no, I'm not so sure I'm going to outlaw that. So yeah, all 4 quadrants work together. And it still wouldn't have happened if we hadn't moved to world-centric, in the left-hand quadrants, world-centric stages of development.
Yep.
So, but the point is, even though the whole notion of the world-centric emergence of moral values was that the previous ethnocentric were fine with slavery. They had no trouble with it. Aristotle had no trouble with it. Again, Buddhism, no problem. Christianity, no problem. Paul even recommends to slaves to, quote, obey your master and love Jesus Christ. So, but when the philosophers of the Enlightenment started writing about the universal rights of human beings, that was radically new for a collective culture. And so when they started doing that, it was first applied to the people that already had power. And that was largely white, European, male, cisgendered, heteronormative, aristocratic, wealthy, able-bodied males. But the principle said all people are created equally, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And all people are to be treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, ethnicity, gender, or creed. And those were principles that just kept expanding and expanding and expanding. So it went from white men, and then it included black men,
Mm-hmm.
and then it included all women, and then it included all gays, and then it included all trans, and on and on. And so what we can't do, what's a really horrible use of a kind of presentism, is to take the point where we've included all of the others and then go back and condemn
Yeah.
the people 200 years ago.
Right.
Because that's one of the most wretched aspects of the discussion of race in America is, at least to hear far left anti-racists, hearts in the right place, trying to do the right thing, but just absolutely condemning everybody who doesn't think exactly the way they do. And that's one of the worst applications of presentism that you can think of.
Yeah.
And that does get back into the whole discussion that we had on social justice and the problems with that.
Yep.
So we have to be really, really careful about that aspect of it. And one of the things that we do as we look at, say, you go back 500,000 years to some of the very earliest indigenous tribes of human beings on the plains of Africa, they are have virtually none of the higher developed cultures and civilizations. They don't really even have grass huts. It's still basically teepees, and the ecological carrying capacity of the original tribes. I'm not talking about tribes today, I'm talking about the original tribes, but it was about 30 people. It was common to throw away 1 or 2 out of every 3 children because you simply couldn't feed them. That's seeing it like that. And 15% of original tribes had slaves.
Right.
And also got engaged in warfare. So we can't go back. And I mean, even the American Indians took their slaves with them on the Trail of Tears. I mean, you can imagine, it's just, both of those are horrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, the Trail of Tears was a barbaric thing for Andrew Jackson to do to the American Indians. And then the Indians taking their slaves with them was a barbaric thing, to happen as well. I mean, these were not pretty times.
Right.
But what we can't do is blame people for those kinds of morals that they had then.
Right.
That's absolutely not fair. And it also overlooks Emily Dickinson. Today makes yesterday mean.
Right.
And it could get mean. So
Yep.
we have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, no, real briefly, Ken, it seems like when we're talking about presentism, I mean, first off, so many of our worst sort of historical blunders comes from a misuse of presentism. So the noble savage, the whole myth of the noble savage, that we were so enlightened and more in touch. Well, no, this is actually just pure postmodern projection onto early societies. They're projecting their own green values and saying, look, this was a clear example. This is how we've always been. This is how we were supposed to be. And goddamn the patriarchy and everything else, we're fucking that up.
Yeah.
It's bad presentism. And the same thing with when we talk about gender, Ken, we always talk about the myth of oppression. Right. The myth of oppression is also generated by presentism. Yeah. We're applying today's individualistic public domain sort of or public sphere, the importance of the public sphere. We're projecting that throughout history and saying, well, this means that, obviously we've always valued the public sphere and so this means that women were clearly oppressed hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, etc. And we've done massive dialogue after dialogue explaining why that's not true. So many of these just really, I mean, they're not just, they're damaging misreadings of history. And it seems to me that presentism, there is a true but partial here. The truth of presentism is, without the notion of presentism, history is just projection. And that's what we saw with Whig history. I'm convinced so much of postmodernism came out as a reaction to Whig history, because so much of sort of the brutality of the Mean Orange meme is contained within that, all the colonialism and all that. So, that's the true part. We definitely want to make space. Hey, good for you guys. You're finally acknowledging that other people and other cultures have other ways of being and other ways of enacting the world. That's great. That's important. The partial is that you don't have a developmental understanding yet of how this actually unfolds. So to you, it's just this pluralistic, oh, well, people are different and people think about things differently and we can't rank it. Well, there's a direction to development here. And we're going to get into this with the next point. Just by us saying there's a direction to development and that cultures evolve not linearly, but sequentially. And there's an important difference there. So all of this is important. And I think that, Ken, what it comes down to is an integral prescription for presentism is simply that an integral historiographer needs to be tracking at all times both the cosmic address of the historical subject that they're trying to study, as well as their own cosmic address and that of their surrounding culture, so that they can make sure their reading of history is clean. And here, C.S. Lewis had a really great short quote here for this. He says, "One passes to the realization that our own age is also a period, and certainly has, like all periods, its own characteristic illusions. They are likeliest to lurk in those widespread assumptions which are so ingrained in the age that no one dares to attack or feels it necessary to defend them." Right. So there's all these unexamined assumptions that every single historian in history brought to their reading of history. I mean, including C.S. Lewis, including, Herodotus, including Tacitus, including Hume and Marx and Toynbee. All of these guys were in a certain kind of way products of their own history, and that in turn affected how they read history. Right. I mean, in other words, some amount of presentism is always going to be sort of inevitable. There's this idea that history itself is a historical product. Right. Well, that's true, but it's a historical product that hopefully is getting better and better and more coherent and more clear and more understandable and more true every step of the way.
Yeah, there's either social learning or there isn't.
Right.
I mean, it's really kind of that simple.
Right.
But what we try to do, of course, even as integral theorists, we also have our own blind spots and things that we can't see. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm saying, people look back on us 500 years from now and they're going to think we're, sort of semi-idiots.
Yep.
Or it might even just be 50 years as the super intelligent machines look back on us and say, oh, super idiots. But we'll find that out. But what we're doing in the meantime is that because a little bit of wholeness is better than no wholeness at all, right, then we try to look at whatever discipline we're looking at. We try to take all of the major schools of that discipline and try to see what little true but partial elements they all contain. Because again, as I always say, the human brain is incapable of producing 100% error. Right. Nobody's smart enough to be wrong all the time. So that
some people get really close though, Ken.
Just so we really do want to look at these. And so whether we're looking at presentism, if we're looking at historical snobbery, if we're looking at teleological historicism, we want to go through and point out both the limitations of each of those and then the partial truths that each of those have. And as we do that, it so far, and we've done this with over 60 human disciplines, and so far every one of them has turned out to be just a little bit better, certainly more comprehensive, certainly more inclusive, certainly covering more of the bases. And then as you get in and watch the battles that occur between whatever the 3 or 4 major schools are of any discipline, and you watch and see how really narrow a view they have to take in order to attack everybody else's views, and it can become really, really clear just how unfortunate an approach those kinds of limited, narrow, restrictive attitudes can be. And particularly given the fact that this is a much, much bigger world than any one of those very narrow approaches tend to latch onto.
Right.
So one of the problems right now, probably one of the biggest of these three fallacies that we face right now, is this broken green social justice presentism. And it's so presentism that, you know, you go back 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, and I mean, there's whole segments of the web that if they disagree with, you know, somebody's political orientation, they will scour the web for the last 30 years until they can find at least 2 sentences that somebody said that are pretty stupid.
Yeah, no, that's right.
And then they drag them out and try to crucify the person based on that. I mean, we saw, you know, Justin Trudeau face the blackface problem too. Now, what he had going for him is that he was the correct political orientation. He was a far left, broken green political stance. So he more or less got forgiven for that. Republican governors who try that don't get quite as much slack, and so that's a problem. Being integral, where neither one nor the other, or again, find ways that all of them have a little bit of truth, a little bit of partiality, and we want to try to deal with that. So if this first orientation is, although it expresses itself in a couple different ways, it's just this broad equality, that whatever present values I have now, those are the only values that we can judge all of history with. And not only that, coming in the other direction, all of those historical times could see things just as clearly and wonderfully as we could see now. So if some of the founding fathers had slaves, it's because it was already a morally evil thing to do, and they knew that, but they choose to do it anyway.
Right.
And most really good people didn't do that. Most good people didn't have slaves or didn't do any of that kind of stuff. But these were bad people.
Right.
They did that, let alone the entire period prior to 1770, where every civilization had slavery and every religion in the world had slavery. And that's just absolutely backwards. That's just absolutely perverse way to read history. And in particular, it doesn't give that whole developmental evolutionary unfolding an understanding where moral drives went from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to integrated. And as we moved up that, then you would expect different types of behavior from people because they and their culture were coming from some of these higher stages of development. And that's the only type of judgment that's fair to use on those people, is make sure that if you're judging somebody historically, that you're judging them according to the morals, needs, and rules that were widespread at that time and that were accepted by the entire culture at that time. And then within those, choose the people that were doing better or doing worse.
Right.
And that's the only fair way to do that.
That's right. Yeah. No, it's beautiful. Thank you. And Ken, I think you just set the table wonderfully for us to move on to the next fallacy, which is chronological snobbery. Again, I so love that phrase. So as I mentioned earlier, this is another term that was coined by C.S. Lewis. He's coming up a lot in this conversation. And the idea here is that, you know, chronological snobbery is a fallacy that basically says that, you know, all of the intellectual, artistic, or scientific contributions from earlier periods are inherently inferior to those of today. So this is coming from the idea that, you know, you had mentioned earlier the quote, history makes, what was it? History makes yesterday mean.
Makes yesterday mean.
This doesn't mean, so chronological snobbery reminds us that that might be true, but that doesn't mean that every individual in history was therefore mean or lower, right, or more of an asshole than the average person today. So I think that when it comes to chronological snobbery, this one can be a little bit, I think, tricky for an integral historiographer. And I think that, you know, there's sort of a needle that needs to get threaded here, because, you know, you sort of, again, laid out the groundwork here. Cultures evolve, and individuals within that culture also evolve. Sometimes they evolve to the center of gravity of that culture. Sometimes they go well beyond that center of gravity. Sometimes they fall well short. And history, I think, is full of examples. In fact, in many ways, it was written by people who exceeded the center of gravity of their culture, and oftentimes paid the price for that. I mean, we've talked time and time again about what happens when you poke your head up above sort of the status quo. 9 times out of 10, it gets cut off. And we've seen that a lot throughout history. So obviously an integral reading of history describes this ongoing unfolding of these various developmental intelligences and capacities over time, which might, again, convince us of a certain superiority that we have over our ancestors. But, you know, I think there's a few important points here. You know, one, you talk about, first off, the difference between when we're talking about development, you use the language of more fundamental versus more significant. And I always thought that that was really clever, politically correct language to say higher or lower, basically. And what I like about that language is that lower doesn't mean worse. Lower truly does mean more fundamental. And as I think we're learning right now, society itself really depends on having this wide spectrum of intelligences and labors and skills. So in many ways, civilization depends on there being a lower. It depends on being a more fundamental. Now, obviously, we as integralists hope to see the center of gravity, you know, getting increasingly ratcheting itself slowly towards, you know, increasingly more and more integral. That's what we hope, but we certainly don't expect for every individual to pop out the other end integral. That's not even necessarily something that we would desire. Second, I think that integral, it's important to point out, integral has never placed an upper limit to human development. We've never said, guys, all roads lead to integral, and then, you know, that's it from here on out. There's no upper limit. You just pointed out, we're going to be subsumed. Your work is going to be subsumed. All of our very best ideas sitting now in 2019, moving into 2020, are going to be sort of funny 500 years from now in a certain way. There will be a lot that gets included for sure, but there's, you know, they're going to be like, oh, those guys were so naive. And I think that this offers an extra challenge to integral historiographers who, again, are really, they need to discern both their own cosmic address as well as that of the subject they're looking at. And if we don't do that, all sorts of again, these unexamined assumptions around things like chronological snobbery can really distort our reading. But again, just to remind people, just because 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, we can say culture was at this level and now we're at this level, that doesn't mean that there weren't just absolutely brilliant people. And it doesn't mean that their ideas were any less brilliant in a certain kind of way than the ideas of the most brilliant people walking around today. And furthermore, I think one of the things that we've seen is actually, you know, one of the things that happens when these people go so far beyond sort of the center of gravity of their culture is their contributions eventually get diminished throughout history. And history is full of examples of like these, where we have these innovations and inventions that, you know, really dramatically had a big impact, but then just faded, largely because people forgot how to do them.
Right.
We've got Greek fire, we've got Damascus steel, Roman concrete, Stradivari violins, this word that I can never pronounce, but the Antikythera device, which is this weird computer they found off like the islands of Greece that was 2,500 years old and so far beyond what we thought people were capable of engineering at the time. So, I mean, there are legitimately, absolutely brilliant people throughout history. However, one of the things that these brilliant people throughout history didn't have access to was sort of the successive paradigms and languages that would actually help encode these ideas in a certain kind of way. So you had plenty of sort of rational thinkers before there was such a thing as rational empirical science, which actually opens up one of my favorite historical eras, which was that really, really weird kind of post Middle Ages, pre-industrial revolution, where we were thinking with rationality and with reason, but it was around things like the humors in the body and alchemy and things like that. It was like rationality in the service of myth, which is just it always reminds me of that Monty Python scene. You know,
Yeah.
she's just a witch, and then they go through the whole.
Yeah.
Oh, she
And we
floats.
actually call that general stage the mythic rational.
That's right. Yeah, or the umber color. I think
Yep.
we've assigned to it, which is a totally fascinating period of history.
Yep.
So anyway, all of this sort of leads up to this idea of chronological snobbery, which I sense that a lot of integral critics would probably say we commit, simply because we have a stage-like conception where things get better over time. But
Yeah, and that's a big mistake, for a lot of reasons. And one is, if you look at some of the central integral elements like quadrants, levels, lines, states, types, the only sort of essentially, mostly and primarily developmental or evolutionary element is levels. And that's what, it's what we mean. And those are the ones that we generally use a rainbow spectrum. So we go from what I used to call infrared, and now, I don't know how I missed this, but a lot of yogic traditions actually call the first chakra crimson.
Mhm.
So it's crimson to magenta to red to amber to umber to orange to green to teal to turquoise to indigo to violet to ultraviolet and so on. And that's levels, that's a spectrum, that's waves, structures of consciousness. But then there are these other four elements that, although they're undergoing that kind of broad unfolding, they also have a lot of other factors that can't just necessarily be measured by how well they're doing in terms of a level measurement. So I mentioned things like the quadrants. If you look back at times of Greece, for example, the quadrants were, particularly in a form of the big three, and then particularly the good, the true, and the beautiful. Those were well known. Those were common. Those were values that people would use to judge their life with. And from Plato on down. And so it wasn't uncommon for a person to actually look at their life and say, okay, how much goodness, how much beauty, how much truth do I have in my life? That's an altogether good thing. You don't hear people today run around saying how much goodness, how much truth, how much beauty do I have. They're using those quadrants. They're using first, second, third person pronouns. They at least understand that there are art and morals and science. But particularly with scientific materialism, we've lost the interior quadrants. We've lost goodness and beauty.
That's right.
And so that's not something that is a good thing that happened. And so we wouldn't have a snobbery as we look back on a place like Greece and saw that kind of thing happening. You mentioned fundamental and significant. And those really are, I mean, I really do like that terminology, and I like that notion, because fundamental isn't just a sneaky way to say inferior.
Right. And I was just joking.
Yeah. I mean, the sequence that I have used 10,000 times, but if you look at quarks to atoms to molecules to cells to organisms, atoms are more fundamental than molecules. Molecules are more significant, meaning molecules include more. They signify a larger reality. But if you take away atoms, molecules are dead.
Yep.
So it's not just, oh, that's a nice lower thing that we can use or not use. No, if you don't have atoms, you don't have molecules.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, if you don't have atoms, you don't have molecules or cells or organisms or humans. And you take any lower level on the hierarchy that's more fundamental, you take that away, everything above it disappears. It is gone.
Yep.
But significant just means it's more inclusive, it's more embracing, it signifies more of reality. So in that sense, it's more comprehensive. And if you take something that's significant, if you take a level of significance off the top, like let's say multicellular organisms, if you kill that, all of the lower levels remain. They're not killed.
Yep.
So if you kill gorillas, well, there's still going to be horses and snakes and tissues, organs, cells, molecules, atoms, quarks. Those will all still exist. So fundamental really is fundamental. And
Yep.
if you don't have it, everything else above it croaks. And the same is true in human development. The same is true in any system of holons. You take mathematics, you have to start with fundamental branches of mathematics and build up. If you take out arithmetic, everything else collapses.
Yep.
So these are really fundamental ways that holons fit together. And so when we look back at earlier ages, we're not just looking at lower levels of moral development. We're looking at fundamental building blocks upon which everything else is resting.
That's right.
I mean, these are absolutely crucial. And so that's what's so great about that. But then, of course, you want to add more and more significance, because more significant is being more complex and it has more consciousness. So this is all good. And they're all resting on these fundamental elements. And so that's a really, really important area. And that categorically stops us from simply looking at the past with an air of snobbery. I mean, snobbery is exactly the wrong attitude to have for these fundamental levels of reality that are being built up. More like, let's say, gratitude would be the attitude that you would have for these things. Right. But then there's these other elements as well. Take waking up. Now, one of the things we have to be really careful about is it's common to say, for example, that we only had really great, sophisticated, enlightened religions way back when. And then we lost that, and it just got worse and worse and worse. Well, in some sense, in terms of waking up, and I'll come to that in a minute, that was lost in several ways. But there's two types of spiritual engagement. One is waking up and one is growing up. And in growing up, this is part of the multiple intelligences that go through structures of consciousness. Waking up is states of consciousness. So these structures, spiritual intelligence, continued to grow. And that's what growing all the way up to the levels of development that actually did, for example, condemn slavery and free slavery and introduce truly world-centric stages of growing up development. What we find is that waking up and growing up are astonishingly, they're relatively independent. You can be quite high in one, spiritual intelligence, which again isn't intelligence, it's how you think or conceive of an ultimate reality. Whereas waking up is a direct experience of that ultimate reality. So these things are two very different things. Spiritual intelligence is a structure. It's a multiple intelligence made of structures of consciousness. When you're at a structure, you have no idea you're at that structure. So if you're at, using Gebser's terms, if you're at magic or mythic or rational or pluralistic, you're interpreting the world that way, but you have no idea that you're doing that. You can't see it. You can't introspect and see structures at all. They're very much like grammar that people use when they speak a particular language. But states of consciousness and waking up, those are direct first-person experiences. When you have a waking up state, you're fully aware of it. You know it's happening, you know it's there, and it's very real.
Self-evident.
Now, one of the problems, just to give one example, is that although spiritual intelligence continued to grow and evolve all the way up into the modern and postmodern era, waking up had a much more checkered history. So in the Middle Ages, it was very common, even though the cultural center of gravity on average was ethnocentric, mythic, ethnocentric, which is why slavery and so on was allowed. But there were also a fair number of sub-schools of Christianity that were contemplative or meditative. And they had, and their aim was actual experiences of waking up. And they were good at it. And they had some very, very brilliant texts. And they had some very, very brilliant teachers. St. John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, St. Teresa of Avila, the Victorian mystics. I mean, on and on. It's a very, very flourishing waking up series of traditions. And then with the rise of modernity and the rise of the Enlightenment, and we saw, among other things, because that was the emergence of a particularly rational, it was the age of reason, and it was a particularly rational era. And so most modern sciences were invented at that time. So between 1600, 1700, we got the emergence of modern physics, modern chemistry, modern biology, modern geology, et cetera. All of those were relatively new. We got rid of slavery because we had this world-centric, rational morality that looked at all human beings. The previous ethnocentric morality would say, well, if you're a Christian, then you have rights. If you're a Christian and you die, you'll go to heaven and live on the right hand of God and Jesus, and you're going to live there forever. There won't be any Buddhists there. There won't be any Hindus there. And all of the people that are having a really good time, they're all down in hell, but they don't have rights like you do. Those were ethnocentric rights. They tended to be racist, tended to be sexist, tended to be misogynistic, etc. With the rise of world-centric, post-conventional morality, we saw the rise of science, the rise of reason, and it becomes a very, very potent source of the whole modern era. But what happened is, with their emphasis upon reason and rationality, they started cutting out all forms of waking up. And part of the problem was that the spiritual intelligence forms of waking up all tended to be mythic, either mythic literal or mythic rational. So your spiritual orientation at that time was you had to actually believe that Moses really parted the Red Sea, and that Lot's wife really was turned into a pillar of salt, and that Elijah really went straight to heaven in his chariot, and so on. All of that had to be believed. Well, when rationality came along, they said, no, wait a minute, that's childish, that's tooth fairy, that's Jehovah, that's and Zeus and Santa Claus. We don't buy any of it. And the modern Enlightenment threw out all of those mythic religious beliefs. And because that mythic religion is also the religion that had tucked away these sub-schools of contemplation and schools of waking up, all of those were mushed together and just called religion and tossed out.
Right.
So we get this wonderful Western Enlightenment that's almost completely bereft of waking up.
Right.
It's just not there anymore. And that's not just a little bit of a bad news. That is a cultural catastrophe of the first magnitude. It is a nightmare. And so there's nothing, no cultural snobbery going on here.
Right.
This is a cultural disaster for modernity and postmodernity. So it's actually only been recently in Western culture at large, and it started in the 60s, and particularly with the green multicultural stage of development, that we started to actually, a lot of the boomers started looking around and saying, wait a minute, what's the Zen Buddhism thing? What's this Vedanta thing? What's this Sufi thing? And all of a sudden they learned about waking up, and then often they go back into their tradition. They'd bypass all that mythic literal stuff. They didn't even read the Bible. The Bible for most of them was just idiotic tooth fairy crap. But they would take up meditation, they'd take up contemplation, and these were profound. And so we're just slowly starting to recapture some of those unbelievable treasures that were being lost. So Integral's tracking all of that.
Right.
And it's certainly not looking at all of that in any sort of snobbery. It's looking at it in exactly the opposite direction. And it's pointing out how truly important and profound much of these previous cultural and human developmental errors and ethics were. They had stunningly profound stuff.
Yeah.
And by the way, of every civilization that's ever had access to waking up, almost every one of those traditions make a distinction between ultimate truth and relative truth. And relative truth is something like science gives us, like the periodic table of elements, or how to do heart surgery, or any number of those. Those are all relative truths. The great traditions maintain, yes, those are extremely important, but they are relative truths. They deal with the relative world of finite, manifest reality. But then there's only one way that you can discover the ground of that reality. It's fundamental, ultimate reality, the ground of all being. And that's through waking up. And waking up has been the only type of truth that's ever been claimed by any human civilization anywhere to be an ultimate truth.
Right.
Everything else is relative truth. They're both important, but don't leave out ultimate truth. How on earth can you have a civilization that has no ultimate truth? It's mind-boggling to me that we're trying to do that.
Yeah.
And the fact that we have one of the deepest, well, I would preface it, we have one of the most advanced technological societies ever, with one of the deepest holes of emptiness and meaninglessness ever both go together.
Yeah.
So we don't look at this as a snobbery. We look at this as an absolute bloody disaster.
Right.
So I don't buy that Integral does that.
Yeah, I don't either. What I really like, Ken, about these two fallacies is that, especially when we enact it the way we are today, they feel like two guardrails on different sides of the path here.
Right.
And one guardrail is preventing us, presentism is preventing us really from overestimating people in history.
Right.
And then chronological snobbery is reminding us not to underestimate people in history. And we have to
you can see again the true but partial nature of both of them.
That's right. Yeah, presentism is here to remind us that we need to take sort of the prevailing cultural norms and attitudes and views into account if we want to have an accurate understanding of that person's cosmic address. Chronological snobbery says, okay, don't stereotype individuals in history by their surrounding culture. You know, I often like the example of ancient Egypt. So, 5,000 years ago, we're magenta into red. We're magic moving into magic mythic, right? So if we sort of stereotype all the people who lived in sort of the ancient Egyptian kingdom, they're, very fundamental and not very significant is a nice way we would put it. Their beliefs are very magical. The pharaoh is literally, based on this belief that this individual has a literal immortality project and will go up to the stars and will live forever if you just do these things right. And I mean,
it's a power god.
Yeah, exactly. It's so clearly a magenta red mythology and ethos and culture and all of that. And yet, within that culture, you had individuals who are capable of engineering some of the wonders of the world, right? You look at some of these pyramids and you look at the Sphinx, it was such a ridiculous engineering accomplishment. So clearly there were individuals who are capable of doing some fairly complex mathematics, which requires minimally orange cognition in order to do. Now, the rest of their lines of development are probably about on par with the rest of their culture, but they're able to excel in these certain kinds of ways. And they were examples of people who were rewarded by their culture for excelling.
And notice that one of the most common features of pharaohs is that they have a serpent power going all the way over the top and right at their forehead. It's unmistakable, the kundalini that they are engaged in. So that's another waking up capacity that these folks were clearly way onto. And that's just, stock that up is something that postmodern West has almost no idea about what the hell that is.
Yep. And that fact, Ken, itself invites so much confusion because now what we have is a bunch of green altitude new agers who are like mining ancient Egyptian mythology for these wake up experiences.
Yeah.
Now, in some ways, you're going to find descriptions of these states that are very, very resonant with how obviously every other tradition on the planet has described them. And there's juice there. There's a value there. But there's also, there's just so much of this sort of new age wankery where we're trying to get back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead and all. And that's not to say there's not wisdom in there, but man, you got to be real careful when it comes to reading that and actually getting it out.
And that's a kind of even goes beyond presentism or the historian's fallacy, actually into a kind of elevationism.
Yeah.
And that's another sort of subset of these, but that's a real major historical fallacy. And it's very common, particularly during a period when romantic writers were writing, and there really was the noble savage. Mm-hmm. And we've gone nothing but downhill since then. Yeah. And that's just as bad, a fallacy operating in the reverse direction.
Totally true. Yeah, and even that it's working in the reverse direction, and I think it's working sort of as presentism always does, because again, what's happening is that green is taking its idealized self and
Absolutely.
projecting it through millennia, and it's, I mean, you wrote an entire book about this.
Yep.
I mean, this is up from Eden stuff right
Yep.
here. Which actually is a great segue to our third fallacy,
Right.
teleological historiography. And this one, man, this one's tricky. So just to define it, teleological historiography describes the attempt to establish a narrative view of history as some relentless march towards a single inevitable endpoint, which is typically our today's views and values and morality. This criticism emerged in response to really our previous colonial efforts to make sense of history. We've already talked about Whig history, but that's sort of the prime example here. All of history is leading to the British Empire. And here we are, we've done it. We've done it. We've achieved it. We are at the
Or with Hegel, it's leading to the German.
right. Right. So yeah, so all of these are kind of based on the idea, well, Whig history in particular is based on the idea that 19th century British liberalism was the apex of human progress, that it was really represented the best that we could possibly expect from history. Now, again, this one is a little bit tricky, I think, for integralists, because we do make room for some degree of teleological tilt in the universe and in our own enactment of history, I think. I mean, you'll correct me if I'm not being accurate here, but someone might listen to this discussion we're having today and again accuse us of our own teleological snobbery. They might hear what we're saying as, all of this sort of, if stages unfold sequentially, then doesn't that mean that we're making a teleological argument for why all history has integral as some endpoint? Now, we already covered that because integral will be subsumed in future historical eras. But I can understand why maybe a naive reading of what we're talking about today might lead someone to that kind of assumption. But I think there's
certainly a naive reading of each of the previous two fallacies would make people think that integral ran into trouble with that.
well,
But
yeah,
as we've seen, we don't. We fully acknowledge the true but partial aspects of both of those, and we'll do the same with this one.
yeah, no, and that's why I like sort of leading with sort of that
Sure.
naive criticism, so that we can be like, okay, well, we're definitely not doing this, so let's tell you instead what we are doing. And again, telos is such a tricky concept. It's baked into the 20 tenets, right? I mean, there's a room for telos. And we, I think, can have some really interesting conversations about how that affects history. But I will say that previous sort of these pseudo structuralist kind of efforts to create a teleological history have been really, really naive and have done a lot of damage, I think, and have caused a lot of postmodern historians to throw the baby out with the bathwater, in terms of a lot of the orange forms of historiography that were really actually important and were novel contributions to how we talk about and how we enact history.
Yeah.
So, I think that's important. Another is that integral, we would never say something like integral is some sort of natural conclusion to history, because we make very clear, again, not everyone's going to make it to integral. That's not even something we would necessarily desire, even though we want to see the world continue sort of approaching integral. We acknowledge that people can stop, quote unquote, stop developing and can enjoy their lives from whatever station of development they happen to find themselves. All we want to do is make them as healthy as they possibly can be at that station of development, which usually involves sort of this meta view where we can say, okay, well, amber is going pathological because of this gap that exists between amber and orange and green, and we want to start closing that gap so that the conveyor belt can basically start functioning again. But we certainly are not sort of whipping people's backs and and marching them towards this integral utopia in the future.
Right. And fundamentally, I anyway, don't believe in an omega point.
Right.
So certainly not within anything resembling a foreseeable future. So part of the problem is that most of the teleological historians, again, whether it's Huygens or Hegel or any of that, do have a type of omega point in mind. Most famously, Teilhard de Chardin.
Mm-hmm.
But there are two different types of telos that tend to get confused all the time. And one is after a particular holon has grown and evolved to a particular sort of mature form, you know, a chicken or an oak tree or whatever it is, it'll tend to sort of settle in that form, and it might undergo, you know, occasional future sort of mutations, but generally speaking, it'll often just, you know, reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. I mean, sharks have been around for, you know, a gazillion number of years without fundamentally changing. So cockroaches, so I mean, an enormous number. Now, what happens if you have, let's say, an oak? It does start with an acorn. And when you're looking at the acorn, you'll say, oh, it has, Aristotle would do this, oh, it has a teleological drive. It's driving towards the oak tree. And so that's one type of teleological drive. And even biologists who didn't believe in the big, like omega point kind of telos, would talk about a teleological drive that was basically the growth drive in any particular living thing. So an egg has a telos, will grow into a chicken, acorn into an oak, and so on. Now, all of those are a present driving towards the future, but that future is the product of a bunch of past actions. So oaks, chickens, sharks, all of them have evolved from much simpler entities. They got more and more complex. And in each case that it has reached a mature form, then it would start as an egg or a seed or whatever, and it would grow to that form. And so it clearly had a kind of directionality. An acorn wasn't growing into a chicken. So there was this kind of telos, teleological drive, but that's not just something in the future coming into existence all on its own. That's the result of a lot of past evolutionary movements that just create these more complex forms, and then they settle in, and then that pathway to that mature form, that's laid down. So that's what they'll follow, and that's the direction that goes. Now, that's not the type of telos, the other main type of telos. And that would be a type of telos that, for example, would be operating in original evolutionary sequences. So again, I'll use atoms to molecules to cells to organisms. When atoms were the only thing that existed, it still had this drive to self-organization. It had this drive to more complex forms. It's what Integral calls eros, but we don't insist on science having to use that term, but it is what we call eros, and it is the drive to transcend and include to more complex entities. So when atoms were first giving rise to molecules, those molecules weren't already fixed. It wasn't like an atom moving towards an oak, because when there weren't molecules, there was no oak.
Right.
There's just the atom. So what did it do in order to do that? So that's a kind of telos that's much more open-ended. And it doesn't have a fixed pattern that it's aiming towards. It just is a pattern of complexifying its original starting points. And it makes atoms that are more complex and more complex, and they start looking like molecules. There wasn't an actual ideal form of a specific molecule that was just lying around. And as soon as the atom self-organized, then this ideal form popped up and the atom went straight to this perfect molecule form that was lying around in platonic heaven or wherever it was lying around, and just sort of dropped down. And that was that kind of telos. That's the kind of telos that certainly most sciences just don't accept that, because it doesn't make any sense in terms of the whole overall evolutionary drive and unfolding as we see it happening. That's, in my opinion, that kind of self-organizing eros, just that push towards a greater complexity and greater differentiation and integration. That's what's inherent. And that's that fifth force that's present in evolution from the start, as it's pushing up like that. It wasn't that there was a big bang and then there were all these ideal forms of an ideal atom and then an ideal molecule and an ideal cell and an ideal organism. And those just all fell into place as things move forward. It was rather what you have, and this is true with human forms of development and interior stages of development. When you are moving from, let's say, orange to green, in 1953 in America, the percentage of the population at green was about 3%. So that wasn't showing up as a fully formed ideal green, that it just started to flop down. It was the product of orange becoming more differentiated and integrated and becoming more complex and more conscious. And so that was moving up. Now, all that was required for this orange to be able to move up into a more complex green, first of all, whatever new holon emerged, it had to fit with whatever was present.
Right.
So it had to match all four quadrants. But then after it had done that, and after it had matched basically the elements of the cosmic address that existed for orange, then with this push, that's where a novelty, a creativity comes into play. And it can go from orange to green in a couple of different ways, but it's just going to be a creative, novel, emergent reality.
Right.
And so that was Whitehead's, of course, his three major principles for the universe was the one, the many, and the third, which was the great one, the creative advance into novelty. So what you're going to get is orange moves into green was the same thing that happened when atoms moved into molecules and molecules moved into cells and cells moved into organisms. If you have to fit, this new holon emerges out of nothing. It comes out of emptiness and shows up, and it will stay in existence if it fits what's already present. So if it fits the four quadrants of the previous holon and then adds its own creativity or novelty, and then that will be carried forward. And so the same thing happens in real evolution, is that we see this creative advance into novelty. The novelty isn't specified ahead of time. It has to fit with what's present and then creatively add whatever it adds. And that could go a couple of different directions. But once it does, it's going to settle down. It's going to be repeated. And then if it's still in the process of being created, then there'll be a new emergent holon. It'll be a new creative advance into novelty, a new addition. That'll settle down. And so what you're seeing in this vertical type of telos is not that it's going from egg to chicken, because that's already been laid down.
Right.
So that's going to have a kind of telos, but that's only because it went through these past stages of adding novelty and having an advance into novelty. And then those got laid down, and then those were repeated. And then as evolution continued, then there would be new emergence, new creative advances into novelty, and those would continue to go forward. So that's what happened as human beings went from archaic stages. Then there was a drive to a creative advance into novelty. And so forms of magic started emerging.
Mhm.
They had to fit with the archaic stage, but then they added their own ingredients, and they were free to do that because they had already fit with everything that already existed. Now they're pushing into territory that never existed before. So they have a bit of freedom, creative advance. And that's what happens. And so as magic started forming and settling down, then that became an actual structure. And it was repeated, it was carried forward, where you can say, well, in morphogenetic field, it was carried forward in cosmic memory, it was carried forward however things are carried forward, but magic got carried forward. And then thousands of years later, as this creative advance into novelty, as Eros continued, then mythic forms started to emerge. And at first they just had to fit with magic forms, and then they could add their own creativity. They were free at that point. Mm-hmm. And so it was a novel creation, something that never appeared anywhere in history. And that's part of that vertical telos. That's part of Eros. And that drive is indeed, it has a direction. The direction is Eros. The direction is transcend and include.
Yep.
But it's not a fixed form that it's aiming for.
Right.
But once, say, a magic form settled down, and then once it started getting applied in all sorts of different areas, then that would end up creating versions of these pathways that would themselves get laid down, much like an egg in a chicken or an acorn and an oak. They would get laid down, and then there would be those sort of horizontal telos mm-hmm. that were being created by this vertical forms of telos, creating entirely new things. And then these sideways horizontal equivalents, whether it was mythic music, mythic mathematics, mythic astrology, mythic belief systems, whatever it was, those would tend to get laid down in ruts. And the ones of those that were selected and carried forward, then they became, in essence, had their horizontal teleology. And so these are two very different kinds of teleology that exists or that's occurring. And so one of them is a true creative advance into novelty. And then others are, once you're at that level of newness, then you can create things at that level.
Right.
And yep. If they are sturdy and repeated, then they'll run their own pathways of growing up. It'll emerge, it'll be a seed or a cell or an acorn or an egg or whatever, and then that'll undergo its own unfolding forms. And those could also be things like unfolding forms of mathematics at an orange rational level. And those do have a directionality, but they're not creative advances into radically new things. That's vertical, and that's different from horizontal.
Right.
Now, part of the problem is that these two get confused a lot. And Plato was one of the ones that tended to confuse them. So he would just see all telos as driving towards an ideal form. But that's actually what happens after a new dimension has come into existence in the creative advance, because the creative advance doesn't have an ideal form already laid down ahead of time.
Right.
It's creating. Creating means something new that never existed anywhere. That's a creative advance into novelty.
Right.
And that's what drives vertical development. And so when we want to try to say, oh, this vertical development is headed towards a perfect omega point, that's confusing a fixed form,
Right.
like an oak or a chicken, when it's still actually a creative advance. And that can go on, as far as we can tell, indefinitely.
Right.
And so at some point, it might be that, and just notice what this would take. I mean, a lot of traditions maintain, and I'll indicate how I think there's some truth to this, but a lot of traditions maintain that the whole notion of yugas is that there's a manifestation of a universe. Brahman spirit breathes out and creates the initial quarks or atoms, and then those start to unfold, moving back towards spirit. And at some point, the present universe just dissolves back into spirit, and then it starts all over again. And then spirit sucks in, the whole universe dissolves, then it breathes out, and a whole new sequence or cycle starts. But notice what would have to happen and why this is so tricky, and why things like omega points, as Teilhard described it, is that for Teilhard, the omega point is when every person on the planet reaches Christ consciousness. Now, if you just think about that 7 billion people that are going to have to move all the way through the stages of waking up, and we can't have them still being an egocentric, narcissistic state. That's not a full enlightenment. So they also have to grow all the way through first, second, and third tier stages of growing up. And that means every person on the planet has to do that in order for everybody to reach an enlightened state. That's hard to imagine how that would happen.
I can even imagine how the world wouldn't just end the next day if everyone had a spontaneous awakening like that. I mean, people would translate this in red ways and in amber ways, and geez, there's a new source of warfare.
Yeah, it's much more likely that at some point when, let's say, 15% of the human population awakens, and then spirit would say, okay, enough of you are on to the game. I'm going to start it all over. And it would suck in, everything would dissolve, and then pow, and off it would go again. But that's not what most people mean by a mega point.
Right.
Is no, only 15% of the people get there. And then spirit says, okay, that's it. I'm calling it off. Yeah, we'll be around. So that kind of a mega point, it sounds wonderful if you think about it for just a minute or two. It's like, oh yeah, everybody will be one. That'll be great.
Yep.
But if you actually start thinking about what that requires, it's maybe a little bit stiffer a requirement than humanity would ever be able to pull off.
Right.
Given that less than 1% of them now have a full waking up, and less than 30% of them are even in pushing up towards second tier. So it would take, humanity is going to really have to get on its game if that's going to happen. In the meantime, all we have to do by this theory is just do good enough the spirit says, okay, close enough. Now I'm going to dissolve y'all, and y'all are going to get enlightened, and we're starting over.
Right. No,
And
that was wonderful, Ken, and particularly your point about omega points. Now, of course, Kurzweil has his own version of an omega point, and the New Agers have their version, and the Christian evangelicals have their own version. I mean, it's just a competition of omega points at this point in history, which kind of brings us to our own omega point in a certain kind of way. But I'm really happy that you made very, very clear that integral doesn't hold itself as being any kind of omega point. It's certainly not the case that all roads lead to integral. I mean, in fact, we're doing better this year in terms of membership than last year, but I can tell you personally, not many roads at all lead people to integral, which is why we're always trying to build so many new damn roads.
right.
So, really in today's world, all roads lead to red. That's the reality of today's world. Red is the inevitable destination that 95% of people are going to hopefully pass through as they continue their development. Very, very few people are making it to integral. So if it is an omega point, we need a stronger omega point.
Right.
And I think the other point here, Ken, is that, there's an important nuance here, which is that, these unfolding stages of development, they emerge through us, right? And there is some telos in terms of how they emerge. You can't have rational unless you've had mythic first.
Right.
These things unfold sequentially, and there is a telos there. However, even though these stages emerge through human beings, and there's a piece of telos in how they emerge, that doesn't mean that the human beings individually move through these stages of development in a linear or even sequential way. Development is messy. We might have one, foothold up here and another way down here, and we're, it's a matter of your total cosmic address at any given point in time and how it interfaces with the rest of sort of your surrounding reality. So I think that's a really, really critical point here. We might say that it is a teleological given in a certain kind of sense that a space like integral is opening up, that we are witnessing the creative advance into novelty in real time. And gee, I think we're all pretty, grateful for the fact that that's happening. But that doesn't mean that any one of us are moving through or even into that space in a linear kind of way, nor does it mean that this is something that is unfolding outside of you. And this is a point I always try to make with people, that if you want to see this world becoming more integral, if you use phrases like, I have a faith in emergence to help you make sense of the world, but you're not letting it emerge through you, you're kind of missing the point. There's nowhere else for it to emerge from other than from the center of our own hearts and our own minds and our own souls. So this is a participatory emergence. And we really need everyone who's watching this now, everyone who enjoys conversations like these, to really get your hands on the wheel and figure out what it takes to participate with this emergence within yourself.
Yeah, and the simplest, I mean, there are an enormous number of things that people can do to try and take more integral approaches out into the world, including, as I said, we have over 60 human disciplines completely reinterpreted. So we actually have integral doctors, integral politicians, integral lawyers, integral educators, integral therapists. I mean, on and on and on. But it all starts basically, if you want to see a more integral world, just you yourself start thinking integrally. Just do that yourself. And that can certainly then apply to things like, if you're looking at history, think integrally about history. Yeah. I mean, all of those cliches about where if we don't remember the past, we're doomed to repeat it. Well, fine. Just from our discussion today, how are you going to remember the past?
Right.
So, I mean, we've seen there are a couple of bad ways to remember the past. And so if you're remembering the past in a bad way, then you could be doomed to repeat that. That's not going to be good. But if you want to act differently, think differently. And that means if you want to act integrally, think integrally. And so that's just the simplest place that you can start. And so that's certainly step one that we would recommend.
Yeah. Yeah. Bring your integral mind online, bring your integral heart online,
Exactly.
align the two and do what needs to be done.
Exactly.
Ken, this has been amazing as always.
Awesome.
Yeah. I feel like we covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
especially when combined with last month's show.
Yeah.
So, as usual, man, thank you so much and happy holidays, Ken.
To you too. And happy holidays to everybody out there.
Here's to the roaring integral 20s.
Exactly. And we
All
will
right.
see you next year.
That's right. Next decade.
All right.
All right, buddy. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.